You got many berry crops up around where you are, Scott?
Nah, it's a little bit hot and dry. There's a few in the Adelaide Hills, through the hills, but not too many up this way.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I think I drove past a couple, a bit of strawberry farm, just south of Adelaide. So
a lot of strawberries down through the hills.
Yeah, so it's a good climate for them.
Did you want me to stop sharing this?
No, it's fine. You can leave
sorry.
that up.
Yep.
Yeah, we're good. Thanks. Start on 3 and then people can come through. Might just give it another minute and just wait for a few more people to come through and then get started. Oh, I might get started, given we've got a fair few people here already.
Yep.
So yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's great to see you all here and such keen interest in this webinar as well. I understand it's a really busy time of year, so yeah, appreciate you taking the time and being here. For those that don't know me or haven't met yet, my name's Ella Roper and I'm the Berry Industry Development Officer for Tasmania. So I work with Fruit Growers Tasmania and Berries Australia. Firstly, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. So we have Scott Mathew from Syngenta. Scott has a strong background in horticultural agronomy and pest and disease management, and he's passionate about helping growers to improve their general knowledge and spray application practices, which is fantastic. So Scott's going to present on a number of topics, sort of ways to improve your understanding around sprays and how to optimise your applications in berry crops. So I'll be covering a range of topics, including how crop protection products work, factors that affect their performance, and how to get the dose right. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Scott for making time in his busy schedule to be here and present to us all. Really, really appreciate it. Given the amount of interest in this webinar, I've disabled mics for the moment and will manage most of the questions through the chat. There's also a Q&A function. However, if you would like to ask a question in person, just use the raise hand feature at the top of your screen, and I can manually allow your mic, and you'll just have to unmute yourself, and then you can go ahead and ask. Feel free to put questions in the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll get to them at the end of each section. I'll be recording this webinar as well for anyone that would like to have a copy. And Scott's also happy to share slides after the session. So I'll send an email out to you all in the next couple of days with the slides and also a feedback survey, which I'd really appreciate you filling out. It only takes a minute or two. That's probably enough from me. I'll hand over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Ella, and thanks everyone for having me on to present some material. We will go through a few different slides and a bit of stuff, so it is broken up in a few different sections, so we can have some time at the end of the sections to ask questions. I'm not able to see the chat function at the moment, but I'm sure Ella can read out some of those questions. When I talk to people about application or present to growers about application or do a dye-night, and I do dye-nights in many different crops, I talk about the 4 key limiting success factors that determine the biological success of an application of crop protection products. And that's really what we want to focus on. The first one is selecting the correct product. And that's really requires the knowledge about the target, what we're trying to control, and how we're going to control that. And it could range from powdery mildew in a crop to whitefly in a crop to two-spotted mite to botrytis. That's the biological target. That's what we're trying to control and selecting the right product for that situation. It's getting the recommended dose right. And that's around checking the product label. And I'll give you some confusing labels, and they're both Syngenta products that could be quite confusing. You can have a rate per hectare on a label for berry crops, or you can have a rate per 100 litres on the label. And how do you determine the correct dose? It's about using correctly calibrated equipment. We don't want to underdose, and we certainly don't want to overdose, because if you're getting close to withholding period and you're overdosing, that could lead to detections in MRLs and things like that in breaches. And is the rate right for the correct weed if you're chasing weeds in a crop? It's the coverage required. So it's around selecting the right spray nozzles, using the right pressure, the right volume to get the coverage that's required. And different products require different levels of coverage. Some you can get away with much lower water volumes, fewer droplets per centimetre squared. Others you need higher water volumes, you need higher number of droplets per centimetre squared, and we touch base on those. And very importantly, it's about getting the timing right. So that requires good observation of the crop, the pest, and the weather at the time. And sometimes you might need to go earlier with the application than you're planning to, because the weather might be coming in a bit crappy for the next 4 or 5 or 6 days. And I always say it's better to be prepared to go earlier than it is to be waiting until the product says it's a 10 to 14 day interval. And you wait right out till that 14 days, and then all of a sudden things go awry and you can't get onto the crop, you can't get the spray out, and it could be 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 days. And I did a bit of an exercise in the viticultural industry with one of the major corporates. The average spray interval for their growers was 18 days. So these things happen. So it's always better to be planning for the shorter interval. If you get to day 10 and the weather's good and you're not going to have any challenges, well, you can let that interval slide. But if you get to day 14 and you must get it on and you haven't got the weather available to do that, well, then you're going to get stuck. When we talk about the target, I talk about two very clear and different targets. I talk about the biological target. So that refers to the pest or disease as being controlled. It could be powdery mildew, it could be botrytis, it could be two-spotted mite. I then talk about the application target. It is the place where the pesticide or the spray must be deposited in order for it to work on the biological target. So you have airborne diseases, you have soil-borne diseases like charcoal rot. And if you're treating for charcoal rot or applying something for charcoal rot and you're putting it all on the foliage and not getting it onto the soil or the base of the plant, you're not going to have a very high success rate. Pythium's another one. We know growers tend to try and control Pythium with some fungicides after the crops emerged, and they really struggle to get effective control because they're putting it on the foliage, not on the soil. Pythium fungicides need to be in the soil to be working effectively. When we work out the dose of a product, we do a lot of trials, and you would be well aware of the chemistry Miravis Prime, and we've had Miravis Solo in potatoes and wine grapes for a while. Generally in Australia, to get those products registered, we tested 8 different formulations across the development process. In grapes, we evaluated greater than 28,000 grape leaves and 38,000 bunches of grapes. So there's a lot of work that gets involved in assessing those trials leading up to submission to the APVMA and then moving towards registration. When we start that initial development work, it's always done as a dilute application volume. So that's our trialist and our contractor trialist applying the product up to the point of runoff as a dilute application volume, and they use a rate per 100 litres to determine the dose. So in this situation, you can see, and the dose here is reflective of the colour that you see in those circles, and you can see as we're going up, the dose is getting higher because you're getting more per 100 litres, and we can see that there's a dose curve here. So at 0.625, increasing efficacy at 1.25, good efficacy at 2.5 mils a 100 litres, and the efficacy starts to decline, so we don't get that significant improvement in efficacy above that dose. So that's the dose that we actually select that's the most efficacious, it's the most economical to use, and it's going to deliver the best results we can without putting on more product to not get the improvement in gain. And that's how we work out the dose. And then we start working on rates per hectare and equating that back down to concentration factors, which you start to see on labels now. And I'll cover off a little bit on those a little bit later in the presentation. So to get our mind in the right space, that's how all crop protection companies develop their products initially. It's a rate per 100 litres of water. Now, some definitions around fungicides and some terminology you probably hear in the market. Preventative fungicides, these are fungicides that are applied before the development of the disease. They generally prevent the germination of the spore or the penetration of the pathogen into the plant. They must be on before the spore germinates. We have curative fungicides that are applied when the disease is present in the crop, but, the big but here, before symptoms are visible. And we have latent infection periods. For powdery mildew, could be 7 to 14 days that the disease is active in the crop before you start to see symptoms. For downy mildew in grapevines, it's 5 to 12 days effectively. So the disease has been in the crop for 5 days before we start to see symptoms. And then we have a range of fungicides called eradicant fungicides. These are applied to the plant disease after symptoms are visible. And there are almost no fungicide products available with eradicant activity. So it's understanding these definitions, and to put them onto a graph or onto a slide, we see the spore germinating here or landing on the leaf. It germinates, it then starts to penetrate, it then starts to colonise the plant tissue, and it then starts to go through its reproductive life cycle and starts to sporulate. And this is the point at which you see symptoms. So all of this period that's occurring from that spore landing on the leaf to this big black line here, the colonisation phase or new sporulation, that's occurring before there are visible symptoms on the plant. And where do some of the products we're using work? Well, the terminology, so preventative fungicides work here, curative fungicides work in this phase, and eradicant fungicides work down here. And where some of the products fit, you might be very common products for you to use. Maravis Prime is a combination of polyflumethafen and flutoxanil. It has a very strong protected fungicide and a very early curative acting fungicide, and it will work up to that stage where the disease is starting to penetrate the plant. The strobilurins on their own, like trifloxystrobin or sulfur or Fontellus, are purely protectant fungicides. So once the plant or the disease has penetrated plant tissue, they have very little, if any, effect on the disease from starting to grow through and colonise. Microbutanil and flute are two products that do have a little bit stronger curative activity, and they'll work up to this stage where you do have some penetration into the plant and early mycelial growth within the plant cells, but they don't work on these later stages of the disease development. And unfortunately for berry growers, I can't keep clicking and get chemistry that does fit out here because there are none. And this is what I'm talking about. It's very important to get the timing right and have short intervals that cover the likely period that you're going to have germinating spores and penetrating spores, rather than sort of leaving the whole disease to go through its complete cycle before you start to think about treating it. How does it look like on a graph? You've got Botrytis cinerea here on a berry surface, and you can see the untreated. You can see the disease has certainly spread across the leaf surface. It's well colonised in plant tissue. When the fungicide was applied preventatively, you can see that fungicide has stopped that germ tube growth along the plant surface. It stopped the penetration into the plant, and it stopped the colonisation of the plant. So that's why we talk about preventative and early curative fungicides. We don't talk about late curative and eradicant fungicides. In terms of characteristics of deposits of products that we're applying on the plant, it's around about the quantity or dose on the surface of the leaf, which is needed for acceptable control. And if we go to a lab, we know that topaz or penconazole is a powdery mildew product in viticulture. We need 75 micrograms per centimetre squared of leaf area for effective disease control. Now, I always tongue-in-cheek say, well, that would be probably the ideal rate to put on the label. But how do we calculate that? It would be near impossible. And that's where we start to work on our dose in rates per 100 litres of water, and then converting that into rates per hectare where it's applicable. We also talk about the percentage of the leaf area to be covered in order to achieve control. And it needs to be higher for protectant fungicides than those that we class as being systemic fungicides. And I'll talk about the difference because systemics are a misused word within our industry. We also talk about coverage, and it should be even and uniformly distributed across the leaf or the plant surface. And it needs to be more uniformly distributed and more evenly distributed for protectant fungicides than for those that move into the plant. And particularly for protectant fungicides and things like copper and mancozeb, those type of chemistries, we need to put the product on in a thick enough layer that it's going to persist up until the next spray. So if we want to be a 10-day interval for mancozeb, we need to put that product on in a thick enough layer that it's going to last 10 days. It's a little bit like painting a house. If we want to paint our house every couple of years, we can put on one light coat of paint and have to redo it. We want to make sure we're doing a good job. We pick a really good paint that's quite thick and we put it on a couple of coats in order to last for 15 or 20 years. And it's around about putting that product on in a thick enough layer that it doesn't weather off too quickly. Reaching the target, we talked about reaching the target uniformly distributed. One of the things that we really struggle with at times is the concept of getting penetration into our canopy. So all of our canopies have a volume of air in them, and we need to be able to penetrate through from this top surface here and get our fungicides and our insecticides deposited down inside that canopy. And that's a real challenge. And I talk a little bit about how we can achieve that and some of the things we can do a little bit later on. But we really need to get our fungicide or our insecticide through as much of that canopy as we can to get effective control of the pathogen or the insect we're trying to target. Droplet spectrum is one of those ones that we can alter relatively easily with nozzle selection. We know that the more droplets you produce and the finer the droplets, the better the biological activity they have, because you're spreading it out and you're getting it much more effectively controlled. But the challenge when we go to, in the old days, we used to use hollow cone nozzles and blast out, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 litres of water, is we get a lot of drift. The finer we go, the smaller the droplet, the more risk of drift occurring. And the bigger the droplet, the less risk of drift. Much better for drift control, but you're getting less droplets out of the same volume of water. So if we halve the droplet size from 500 to 250 micron, we get 8 times more droplets out of the same volume of water. And if we halve it again, we're suddenly at 64 droplets. Really good coverage, but there's a risk of drift. So you can achieve some really good results if you know the conditions and you match it accordingly. As a general rule, systemic pesticides require less drops, less coverage. Contact pesticides or protected pesticides require more drops, better coverage. And when you look at it relative wise, and it gives you a bit of a guide here using some water sensitive paper. So the top one there on the right hand side, as you're looking at it, is showing at 100 droplets per centimetre squared. That's really good when you're targeting things like mobile insects that are quite moving around. You know, you're getting post-emergent herbicides if you're looking at things like Fusilade or those type of products, or, you know, if you're using glufosinate or gramoxone or spray seed, you need to get those higher droplet counts. When you're looking at systemic or xylem mobile products, you can get away with results down around like this because you're talking at 20 to 30 droplets per centimetre squared. So just relatively looking at it, that gives you a bit of a guide of what 100 droplets look like per centimetre, what 60 droplets looks like, and 20, and so on. And you can see there, we have a range of recommendations based on insecticides, herbicides and fungicides and foliar nutrients, and then we break them down into systemic and contact. And that's what I'm going to cover next so that we can understand what that terminology means. So protectant or contact products, the droplets spread out on the surface where they're deposited. They do not move inside the plant. And things like sulfur or thiovate jet, chlorothalonil, copper, mancozeb fall into that category. So they're surface acting. They don't move into the plant at all. We then have other products that have volatilization or vapor activity. So after these compounds are applied, they fume, they release vapors, and some of those that are very well known are thiovate or sulfur. You have flute, lengen, kasabi, all have a volatilization where they release some vapors that will actually help control the disease you're targeting and help move through different areas of the canopy of the crop. Then we have the vast majority of products that we label as systemics. And unfortunately, the industry allows companies, and Syngenta is guilty of this, and we're working towards changing it, that where we have a product that moves into the plant surface at all, we can label it as a systemic product. But unfortunately, it's very misleading. So we have translaminar products that are products that move from the side of the plant they're applied to the direct opposite side of the plant. So if you can imagine holding a leaf up, pushing a pin through that leaf, from the top of the leaf to the bottom of the leaf, that's how translaminar compounds work. They move directly through the leaf. We then have xylem mobile products that move outwards in the xylem. So they'll move into the leaf, into the xylem, and then they'll move through the leaf in an outwards direction. So they move outwards. They don't go down the leaf, down into the root system. They only move outwards from the point of application. So that's where we sort of look at, sometimes we combine the attributes of products. And Moralis Prime has 2 active ingredients, pidoflumethafen, which is the group 7 component. Now that moves through the leaf and into the xylem and moves within the xylem. So you get some movement within the leaf or in the plant surface. Flutoxanil, or the group 12 component, is a contact fungicide. So it only stays on the surface of the plant where it's active against spore germination and that germ tube growth. So we've got complementing modes of activity and where it does work, and they complement each other with product choice. And that's why we sometimes choose these combinations. So we have a very strong protectant and an early curative that is a little bit systemic, moves into the plant in translaminar and xylem mobility, and we get that combination working quite well. Then we have those that are phloem mobile. So these are the truly systemic products. They move upwards from the point of application, so you can apply them to the roots and they'll move up and protect the foliage. And likewise, you can apply them to the foliage and they'll move down and protect the roots. So these move both ways in the plant. Generally, the most common phloem mobile product you would use would be glyphosate. There are some grass selective herbicides, but there are no fungicides. Well, there's only one fungicide that is phloem mobile, and that's phos acid, which moves both ways in the plant. It's the only fungicide. There is also one insecticide that moves both ways in the plant, and only one. And if you want to put that name in the chat, I'll let you have some guesses to see how many might get it right. So we're asking for the only insecticide that we know that is phloem mobile, truly systemic, moves both ways in the plant. What that looks like when we look at radioactive carbon. So here we've treated active ingredients with radioactive carbon so that we can strip the wax away and we can X-ray with use radioactivity to see where the product's actually moving to in the plant. This is Ridamil, our metalaxyl formulation, and you can see the bright red dots where the product's applied. And you can see that after 72 hours, the product's starting to accumulate in the leaf margins and it's moving outwards from the point of application. You can see there's very little that's moved down through that PDL. There's a little bit, but not worth writing home about. You can see the movement there. Dimethamorph is another downy mildew fungicide, and you can see the bright red dots again where it's applied. Now, this is a true translaminar type product with very little xylem mobility, and you can see that it hasn't moved anywhere near the same level that metalaxyl has moved. And both of those products are labelled as systemic fungicides. Now, when you're applying them, you could potentially require different water volumes if you want to go through and you have to desperately go through and treat for downy mildew or Pythium phytophthora. You want to use something like metalaxyl, you could use a lower water volume because you know the product's going to move through the plant effectively and give you more coverage against the disease. Something like dimethamorph, you would need to apply more droplets more evenly across the leaf surface. And then we have a product called chlorothalonil, or you might know it as Bravo Weather Stick. It is a truly rainfast protectant product that binds to the wax on the plant and does not move from the site of application. And you can see that here. It has not moved at all. Very good from a rainfastness perspective, but you certainly need, more droplets, higher water volumes, better coverage for that to be as effective as for this one and in this one as well. So when I talk to growers, I generally, if you're going to have a range of products you're using, set your application up to apply these and you're going to get very good results with these other two. If you set up purely low water volumes, fewer droplets, big droplets to just apply metalaxyl, you're going to be disappointed with the results you get with dimethamorph and likewise with chlorothalonil. So they're three different fungicide mode of action groups, and even within fungicide mode of action groups, so these are two strobilurine fungicides, and you can see here where the product's being applied to a potato plant on the PDL. Amistar or azoxystrobin is quite mobile in the xylem and will move in the xylem quite freely, whereas pyraclostrobin doesn't move anywhere near as effectively. This one can be applied by air and is registered as such for multiple diseases in potatoes. This one isn't registered for aerial application for a number of diseases. It only has one disease it has an aerial registration for. So you can see where how the product moves and the biokinetics, it does impact on some possibly the registrations, but also the use pattern. When we talk about droplets and coverage, you need some small droplets in order to be dragged by the turbulence. So when you have a broadleaf crop, it could be a strawberry canopy, it could be blueberry canopy, it could be any canopy that has a big leaf, it's very hard to get past those big leaves with droplets. How do we do that? We need to get the droplets moving in the turbulence. We need to be creating a little bit of turbulence around those leaves. We need the leaves to be moving to allow us to achieve that. It's a little bit like, I use the example of rainfall and using an umbrella. If you're in Launceston walking down the street in summertime and you have a big summer storm, big heavy rain droplets, you put the umbrella up, the droplets hit the umbrella, they splash a little bit, but you don't get wet underneath the umbrella. It does an effective job. If you're walking down the main street of Launceston in July or June and you have one of those typical Launceston misery sort of days in that weather, that winter time where really fine droplets, a little bit of breeze around and a misty rain, you put the umbrella up, that misty rain is carried in air currents and comes around and folds around that umbrella and you get wet underneath. Droplets are the same. We need some finer droplets so they'll move in air currents. So they'll move through and deposit themselves on the back of the leaves or onto leaves that are behind them. The same with fruit. You know, if you're hitting a strawberry and you've got all the big droplets that are sitting on the front of that strawberry, so we're spraying in this direction, how do we get them around to the back of that strawberry to give us some protection? We need those finer droplets, so they'll actually curve around the strawberry in that air as it's moving past the strawberry. They'll curl around and they'll deposit themselves on the back of the fruit. And I'll show you a good example when we talk about that from a bunch of grapes. And you can see where we're using airspeed in the wind tunnel. You reduce your airspeed, you increase the turbulence around there, and you can see the smoke is curling around the back of that bunch of grapes. If we're pushing too much air and we're not allowing the turbulence, we're not allowing that air to actually move around the object, we're getting less smoke curling around the back of the bunch. We're getting less droplets around there depositing themselves on the back of that bunch. So it's about matching up airspeed with what you're trying to achieve and creating that turbulence displacing air. Just some good examples there. We talked about, you know, volumes of air. The direction or the aim of air is to direct the column of air. So you might have a volume of air inside this canopy. You need to displace that from the canopy and replace it with air containing the product you're applying. So it might be flute for powdery mildew, it might be switch for botrytis, it might be something for two-spotted mite. The aim is to try and displace all of the air that's sitting in this canopy, push it out and replace it with air containing the crop protection product. And it's really important to do that. And it's something that is really critical. And I was just saying to Ella before you joined that I've been doing some work with some watermelon growers around water volumes, and they're up to 850 to 900 litres of water. And they're not achieving acceptable control of whitefly and powdery mildew in the crop. We've got one of them that's been listening and working, and we're getting this air movement. We're moving air, we're displacing air. They're down to under 300 litres and having acceptable results. The other grower is still challenged at the moment to drop his water volume down because he thinks just water is improving coverage, and it's not the case. It's a combination of water, droplet size, movement of air. And we show you some examples of air and moving canopy. Likewise, in upright crops, you know, if you're using air assistance, and air assistance is really good to move air because it's pushing. So it just moves that air, and we want to move the air from in the canopy to outside the canopy, and we want to replace it with air that's got chemical in it. We don't want to go too far because then you're not going to have any protection on this side of the canopy, but we want to go far enough that we've got protection right through the canopy. So it's about matching the volume of air with the canopy to achieve what you need to do. One of the simple things I like doing is putting flagging tape on the outside of the row or the canopy. And then if you're going through and you're using air, you can actually see that flagging tape starting to move, and you can gauge where the air is getting through there, and you can just move it so that it flutters a little bit, and you know you're displacing that air because the air is going through the canopy and moving that flagging tape a little bit. And you can see a situation here. Hopefully this is going to work. Going to play. Yeah. So you can see, and I'm sorry, apologies for the noise, but you can see the extra movement we were getting out of the plants on this side just by creating some more turbulence. And we did that by using angled nozzles. So rather than nozzles that were spraying straight down into the crop, we angled the nozzles to create the turbulence. And you could see as they were spraying, the leaves in those strawberries were fluttering that little bit more. We were actually getting better coverage further down through the crop than we were with the higher water volume spraying straight down. And we were using significantly less volumes in this area of the crop. So it's just an example about, you know, you might not have air assistance. How do we help improve turbulence? Angling the nozzles, looking at different technology that can be used to be able to do that. And a simple dropping and using and selecting some nozzles that had a 30-degree angle on them, or you could use something like twin caps from an air induction point of view, just helped move those leaves around a little bit more. Water sensitive paper, it's a really good tool to quickly and easily check your coverage. And you can see up here, we've got good even application in this situation. We've got uneven application down here, and we've got excessive application leading to runoff on this example here. And I can guarantee you, no matter how good you set up your sprayer, you're going to have some of this, which you will have on the outside of the canopy, on the edge, or on the top. You'll have some of this because it's not possible to get 100% efficiency on your application. The aim is to try and have as much of this as we can and minimise these other two. But you're always going to see some of this in every crop you go into, every situation. It's about maximising that good, even application coverage that we're trying to achieve. I'll just pause there. Are there any questions on some of that stuff that's come through?
Feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand using the raise hand feature as well if you'd like to ask in person, and I can unmute you manually. But I suppose I've got a quick one to start off. I suppose with the Xylem mobile products, I guess you want to get that really inside or at the bottom of the plant so that can actually come out rather than just at the top or the outside. Is that right?
Correct, Ella. So you want some on the leaf so that it moves through the leaf and gets to the point of activity where you need it, where you're working quickly. You would also like to have some on the PDL, and some products will move through the PDL a little bit more, and they'll continue to move out into that leaf. So you've got the product that you're applying to the leaf moving out on the xylem, getting to the margins, and that gradually dissipates over time because of the movement out. If you've got some coming from the PDL and moving up into the leaf as well, you're extending your level of protection and you're getting the maximum you can out of that product. So right. Entire coverage of the plant is advisable.
That's good to know. Also, another quick one. I suppose in your experience, what's the easiest way, I suppose, for growers to measure their coverage? Is that using that yellow water-sensitive paper? Is that probably the easiest way to do that?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. There's a product called, or there's a lot of sunscreen products around, like Surround, that are very effective if you're using a sunscreen type product because of the intense heat that you might be getting at times. They're really good to check the coverage. Water sensitive paper is easy to stick onto some leaves, put it near some fruit, test it. You can see it very quickly. I do a lot of work with growers using a fluorescent dye, and we spray the product out late in the afternoon. We then go back and we look at it and in nighttime with a UV black light. And that's probably the most effective way to check all your coverage, because it picks up the really fine droplets that you're depositing inside the canopy. But it's a little bit harder to do that sort of stuff at this time of the year because you've got to wait for so long in the evening to be able to get out into the crops in somewhere like Tasmania, or even up here, you're probably waiting until 8:30, 9 o'clock to do that. And you can only look at it under dark conditions with the UV light. But either the Surround, the kale and clay, or the water sensitive paper is a really quick way of checking during the day while you're spraying if you want to.
Yeah, great. Oh, that's good to know. We've had a couple of suggestions as well for that for mobile product. Someone suggested imidacloprid and someone suggested Movento.
Oh, one is right, one is wrong. Imidacloprid is quite a xylem mobile insecticide. So you can put imidacloprid on the soil and you'll protect the foliage against insect attack. It doesn't move the other way. So if you do a foliar application, it won't protect the roots against soil-borne insect attack. Whereas Movento, you see it in all of their advertising. You'll see the little aphid being hit with the two arrows going in both directions. That's signifying very easily in a very visual way that it moved both ways of the plant. So it's fly mobile and it's xylem mobile. So Movento is currently the only insecticide that is fly mobile and xylem mobile in Australia.
All right. Well, good to know.
Thanks. All right, moving on to factors that affect the performance of the product choice. So we're all very conscientious and we're putting our spray into the tank and we want to go out and we're intending to put on 100% of our dose. Unfortunately, this is an example not too far away from where I live. This was a grower spraying his almond crop at flowering, and you can see there that he's not really depositing a lot of that fungicide on the target. So you'll get losses due to atomisation, transport and impact, and you might lose 20% of what you're trying to apply. Then because you've chosen the wrong adjuvant, you haven't included adjuvant, you haven't read the label, you're getting poor retention on the target, you can lose some more of that active ingredient, as you can see here in this situation, where it's dripping off the bottom of the tomato. Then due to inefficient and slow uptake, and we talk a little bit about xylem mobile products, and we cover that off on the next slide, you get a further loss of active ingredient and you get less absorbed. And then because it's hot and dry or it's cold and wet and you're not getting efficient translocation through the plant, you lose more of the active ingredient. So all of those good intentions of applying 100% of the dose, if you get everything wrong, you don't hit the target, you don't retain it on the target, it's inefficient, it's not moving into the plant effectively, it's not moving around the plant where it needs to be, you can actually get significant losses that result in, only 2% of that active ingredient being available for the job you're applying it for. And that's courtesy of some work done in New Zealand that have crunched those numbers for us. And when we talk about some of those factors, where does that go? Yeah. So a couple of the key factors that can impact spray application. So products that are xylem mobile or translaminar or phloem mobile, they can only enter the plant when the active ingredient is wet in solution. And what I term is the droplet is alive on the plant. It's wet. It allows the product to move through the leaf surface and into the leaf. Once the active ingredient or that droplet dries, you get no further uptake of the active ingredient in the plant. So you've got one shot at it. And you can see here that that droplet, the evaporation of the droplet, doubles when temperature goes from 10 to 20 degrees, and it doubles again from 20 to 30 degrees. So you can see you can get significant impact in the uptake of those products that are needing to get into the plant as the temperature increases. Along with that, humidity plays a big impact. So the lower the humidity, the quicker that droplet is going to dry on the plant surface. The higher the level of humidity, there's more moisture in the environment, the slower that droplet evaporates. And again, active ingredients can only enter the plant while they're in a liquid solution. And when relative humidity drops from 95 to 85%, the evaporation will double. 85 to 70, it doubles again. 70 down to 45, it doubles. 45 down to 0, it's doubling again. So you can see the impact that this is having on product and performance. And when you look at it relative to different droplets, and we showed you some of those droplets earlier in different sizes. So if we have a droplet that's 100 micron in size and we're applying it in conditions that are up here, so it could be at 20 degrees and 80% or 85% relative humidity, it's going to dry in 62.5 seconds. Not a long time. If you go to a 400 micron droplet at that same level, it's going to take 1,000 seconds to dry. So you've got a lot more time for that microbutanol or that flute or that pidoflumethafen in the Miravis Prime to get into the plant where it needs to be to work. Or it could be the miticide you're putting on that needs to get into the plant to work. It gives you a lot more time. When you come down to these conditions here, and this red line, the delta T of 12, 100 micron droplet is only lasting 10 seconds. And the 400 micron droplet is lasting 166 seconds. So you've got 16 times more time to get the product into the plant. And one of the things I hear quite frequently, yeah, it doesn't affect Tassie, we don't get too hot and we've got good levels of humidity. Well, I just did a bit of an exercise this morning, and Launceston at 11 a.m. today, using BOM data on temperature and humidity, was sitting right there, smack bang in the middle of the green area. And green is go, orange is caution, red is you probably should stop, just like a traffic light. What was Launceston at 2 o'clock today? It was starting to get into the orange. So you were starting to reduce the time products had to get into the plant. You're starting to get in those areas. So what can you do in this situation? If it's a bit hot and dry, you can produce a bigger droplet, which is going to give you a lot more survival time, but it reduces the number of droplets you have covering the plant. So your coverage is compromised. The spread and even coverage could be compromised. So everything we're doing is a bit of a compromise in trying to get the maximum efficiency we can when we're applying crop protection products. It's also about growth dilution, and this is really important for protectant fungicide. So if you put out a protectant fungicide on a leaf that's this size, that leaf expands, the product doesn't necessarily expand out with it. So you get that growth dilution impact. All those droplets, if it's chlorothalonil, are spread. So those droplets would be spread out right around that leaf, and you'd have big gaps in between those droplets where a disease, a spore could land on the leaf, germinate, and start to colonise that tissue. So that's why we set respray intervals, 10 to 14 days, 14 to 21 days, 7 to 10 days. It's around that growth dilution and residual impact on the plant. We also talk about, the impact of rain and rain fast periods. Wind reduces the ability of the plant to weather and the ability of the chemical to weather off and stay there for longer, and then UV degradation on surface residues. A simple rule of thumb, if you can't find a rain fast period on the label, reach out to the supplier of your ag chem products and ask them. If they can't give you one, and you need to have a bit of a guide, when the product is as dry on the plant surface, that's almost as rain fast as it's going to be. So that's only a rule of thumb if you can't get an actual period. So some products might be 2 hours, some might be 30 minutes, some are an hour. But if you can't get one and you need to have something to work off, when the product is dry on the surface of the plant, that's pretty much as rain fast as it's going to be. Spray drift is becoming a real issue and something we need to be very aware of moving forward, and it's around about the license to operate. As operations and urban developments are starting to spread further and encroach in farming areas, drift is becoming really important. And you can see here, it's around making sure that we're not seeing any of this sort of stuff. My almond example, we're trying to minimise this as much as possible. And again, it comes down to simple things like nozzle choice. And you can see here, we went into an operation in close to Melbourne, and you can see the grower's nozzles. You can see the amount of fines that are being produced. Now, he's not likely to lose a lot of product outside the structure, and probably not going to be visible by people that are living or driving past this operation too much, but he's losing a lot of the chemical he's trying to apply. And you can see the finer droplets are moving down here, whereas just changing the nozzle spectrum, droplet size and orientation, you can see we're producing less fines in this area here with the angled nozzles than with the grower nozzles. So a simple nozzle choice. We heard earlier how it can improve turbulence across the crop surface and improve penetration into a canopy, and you can also reduce drift by going to things like air induction nozzles. You can use angled nozzles. There's a lot of nozzle technology out there, and it's just around playing around with that technology to see what suits the operation the best to give you the most effective use of the spray. Adjuvants. Another question I could pose to everyone: how many growers that are on here or people that are spraying apply an adjuvant or put an adjuvant in the tank every time they go and spray? And quite commonly, if I'm doing a meeting and I say how many growers do that, the majority of hands will go in here and say, we just put an adjuvant in. The simple rule of thumb is if the label tells you to apply an adjuvant, apply an adjuvant and apply the adjuvant that's recommended on the label. If a chemical label doesn't have the requirement to add an adjuvant, there's a very good reason for that. It's not required. The work has been done. The 5 to 8 years of trial work has been done to show there is no agronomic benefit in an increase in efficacy putting an adjuvant in with that product versus not putting an adjuvant in. It's in everyone's best interest that if there is an adjuvant required, that we put it on the label and we'll tell you what adjuvant you need to use. And the reason some of these adjuvants can cause some problems is if you look at water applied to the leaf surface, there's a good surface tension in that water droplet. It really beads up. You've got a low surface area contact here. If you put an oil in, particularly one that has some surfactants in there, you break the surface tension a little bit more. But oils are very good because they reduce the droplet evaporation rate. And that's why some products require the addition of an oil, because the product needs even more time than normal to get into the plant. So we put an oil to reduce the evaporation of the droplet. Non-ionic surfactants will generally break the surface tension of a water droplet sufficiently to give better spread across the leaf surface. And then we have modified organosilicons that break the surface tension so much that they'll spread much more effectively across the leaf surface. So you can see a much greater spread. Excellent for spreading across the leaf surface. But if you're looking at evaporation rates, these ones are also going to dry much quicker than these ones. And certainly oils have a very good anti-evaporation properties. And then you've got the water. So whilst they're very good for coverage, they can, when you're sort of borderline temperature and humidity, they can reduce, and certainly on some labels, they're not actually recommended for things like herbicides or for certain products. But the key take-home message with adjuvants, read the label. If the label says to apply an adjuvant, add the adjuvant that is recommended on the label. And if it doesn't say to add an adjuvant, you don't need to put one in. And you can save yourself a little bit of money. And using the right rate of adjuvants, one of the common things I see, it's just an adjuvant, we just stick in what we think's right. You can actually change the properties of adjuvants if you don't get it right. And this is an extreme case, but you can see I wasn't telling porkies when I had the last slide up, that's a water droplet with no surfactant. You see the surface tension is making that a very spherical shape. Agril, which is a non-ionic surfactant at the recommended rate of 10 mils, breaks that surface tension and you get a greater spread across the leaf surface. If we put too much Agril in, you can see that it breaks the surface tension so much that you just significantly increase the spread across the leaf surface. And again, you can change the properties of an adjuvant. This droplet here will dry much quicker than this one and that one. So you're reducing the time. You can also cause some other problems with adjuvants if you get the rate wrong. A few other little bits and pieces. Water quality is one of the key things. It doesn't have as big an impact on fungicides as it does insecticides and certainly herbicides. So dirty water deactivates a lot of herbicides, in particular if you use bipyridal chemistry like spray seed or gramoxone, reglone, those type of chemistries. If you were to put them in water that was like this, and that's an actual sample of some spray water that I was sent a photo of, it deactivates that active ingredient very, very quickly. pH can impact some products, and it tends to impact some of the older fungicides that we had we're not using quite as commonly now. It certainly impacts some insecticides. It's not having as great an impact on herbicides as we necessarily thought before, but ideally we'd want to be spraying with pH neutral water. And then hard water can have an impact on certain products, particularly things like glyphosate, other products like grass selective herbicides, and it's easy to tell whether you've got hard water or not, and generally it's not too much of an issue down in Tassie. If you get the water source you're using, you get a bar of soap and you rub the soap in your hands and you get a nice lather from the soap, the water's not hard. If you can't get a good lather, you probably want to get that water tested just to see whether it is hard water or starting to become hard from the source that you're using. Just a time check here. I know we're getting close, but are there any other questions that have popped up, or do we want to wait till the end?
Perhaps we keep going for the moment, Scott.
Beautiful. All right, what can we do with a well-calibrated sprayer? First and foremost, get the spray on your target, remembering the biological target and the application target, the site we need to get. We need to ensure thorough coverage. We don't want to lose any spray to the environment, get drift, cause off-target damage, or we can target specific sections of the crop if that's what we're trying to achieve. If you spend some time in New Zealand in viticulture, quite often their botrytis applications just target the bunch stone that is very easily to identify, and it's in a very narrow zone in a vine canopy. So they just target that with a botryticide rather than spray the entire canopy. We know that different crops require different water volumes and can change significantly. Quite often, and I'll go into an operation and you're spraying a full canopy crop at a water volume, but you're using the same water volume for a much smaller canopy. Is there required? No, you don't need that same level of water volume. Can you change it? Yes, you can. Can you increase efficiency? Yes, you probably could. You could reduce your water rate significantly by just looking at what you're spraying and trying to achieve the best coverage, and even having a couple of different nozzles on the boom so that you can flick them around and change depending on the crop you're going into, because it does make a bit of a difference. And when you're trying to get across a lot of country, you want to be able to do it as effectively as you can. Labels in Australia are legally binding documents. You generally have directions for use, and if there are restraints on a product, they'll be on the label. E.g., an example here, you're seeing do not apply by aircraft. and do not apply by equipment carried on the back of the user. So they are do nots and they're restraints for use. We also have spray drift restraints, and some products will have this on the label where, except for when applying orchard air blast equipment, do not apply with spray droplets smaller than a medium spray droplet category. So it's starting to become an issue on the label. So a product like Switch, for example, in strawberries, not being applied by orchard air blast equipment, being applied by boom, should be being applied using a medium spray quality. If you're using ultrafine nozzles or hollow cone nozzles, you're going to be struggling to deliver a medium spray quality. If you're spraying a berry crop with an air blast equipment, you can spray using less than a medium spray quality. Do not apply in winds, etc. Users must keep these accurate written records, and they must be kept for a minimum of 2 years. That's something we should do, and you do with spray diaries. There's also things starting to come on as products are being reviewed by the APVMA, and some of those are things called buffer zones. So these are downwind mandatory buffer zones. They're always downwind. So you can see here that a buffer zone for a vertical sprayer in this product for bystanders not required for any natural aquatic areas, it's 5 metres. So you must be at least 5 metres from the downwind side of the buffer zone. Pollinators not required, vegetation areas not required, livestock areas not required. But where it's needed, it will have on the label now what your buffer zone will be and how far you need to be from the downwind target. As I talked about earlier, labels will vary for strawberries, and this is a couple of examples. They're both Syngenta products. Maravis Prime has a rate per hectare on the label, where Switch has 80 gram per 100 litre water rate suggested. That rate suggested is for high volume dilute spraying up to the point of runoff. For concentrate spraying, and I'll show you how you can work out that rate and a concentration factor, you do not exceed 800 grams. So that's the maximum we can apply, but depending on the water volume to achieve point of runoff, you can actually apply less than 800 grams of Switch per hectare if you follow the label directions. Whereas Maravis Prime, the minimum is 750 mils a hectare and the maximum is 1,000 mils a hectare. So products will, it does get a little bit confusing at times, but you've just got to read the label and understand. So dilute spraying is using any sprayer set up to apply volumes of water up to the point of runoff and matched to the crop being sprayed. The point of runoff is the amount of water required to wet the plant to the point where some of those spray droplets join together and run off the foliage. And you will get point of runoff on the outside of a canopy well before you get point of runoff on the inside of a canopy. And I always say to growers, you've got to look past that point of runoff on the outside, and you've really got to look at the point of runoff inside the canopy. So open up the canopy, see what the droplets are doing inside the canopy, because that's where it's hardest to get coverage. How do you work it out? Get out in the crop, apply different test volumes at least 3 key times in a season, or you can use industry guidelines or expert advice. But the best way to do it is get out, test it with your water sensitive paper, test it with water volumes, test it with the dye or the clay, and have a look at exactly what a dilute water volume is. And then for this example, we'll switch water volume to reach point of runoff. In this example was 800 litres of water, was determined by the grower. The rate for switch is 80 grams per 100 litres. So how many lots of 8? It's 800 divided by 100. So it's 8 times 80. It's 640 grams a hectare in this example, where the grower's gone out and determined that he is dilute spraying. So he's applying a product to the strawberry canopy that's point of runoff right through the canopy. His rate is 640 grams. The required dilute spray volume will change, and sprayer setup and operation may change as the canopy gets bigger and denser. So it's something to be mindful of. If you're not spraying at dilute water volumes, you're concentrate spraying. So that's using any sprayer set up to apply water volumes less than those required to reach point of runoff and match to the crop being sprayed. So how do you work out your concentrate spraying? Well, again, you first have to work out your dilute application volume for the canopy. You must get out in the crop to do that. You need to do that in order to calculate the concentrate mixing rate. And your concentration factor is the dilute application volume divided by the chosen application volume. So when we do the same example before, but we're now concentrate spraying, you can see the original water volume the grower determined was 800 litres to reach point of runoff. However, to be efficient, get across the ground effectively, tank size, all of the things, they want to put on 400 litres of water a hectare, and that's fine, but you have a concentration factor of 2. So it's simply the 800 divided by 400, so it's 2. Remembering the rate for switch is 80 grams per 100 litres. The application rate is suddenly becoming the concentration factor times that, so it's 160 grams per 100 litres. We're doing 4 lots of that. So 4 times 640 grams, 4 times 160 grams is 640 grams a hectare. Now that's exactly the same rate if we were just applying a dilute application volume. So it's a little bit more complicated to get it right if you're using a product that has a rate per 100 litres than it is a flat rate per hectare, but it's not too onerous a task to do. And when you look at it, the steps a little bit more detailed than what it is for dilute spraying. But regardless of what spraying you're doing, whether it be dilute or concentrate, the rate for any given area must be the same when there is a rate per 100 litres of water on the label. So that's the end of the presentation today. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
We've got one here. What's the best way to find out the compatibility of different chemicals when you mix them?
The best way, you should always be finding out before you mix them, and you should ring the chemical company or your chemical supplier to ask the question, because where there are very common mixes that are likely to be used, so when Syngenta and Bayer and Corteva are developing products, or Adama or New Farm, whoever it might be, when we're developing new chemistry or new products or new formulations, and there is a common mix that's likely to be applied, we will test that combination in our development work. And if there are key nutrient products that are likely to be applied as well, we'll test the common ones. We can't test all the nutrients because there are so many different brews. But when we do that, we test for biological efficacy, so the fact that they don't reduce the ability of the product to control disease or insect, and we look at crop safety so that there's no concern with crop safety on the plant. It's not going to cause burn, it's not going to cause phyto. And we also test that they're physically compatible, the fact you can actually mix them in the tank. Because quite often you can put products in a spray vat and they'll behave very nice and not do anything untoward. As soon as you put them out on a crop, they can have an impact on the biological efficacy of the product, or they can actually increase or decrease the level of safety on the crop. So always check with the chemical supplier. And if they can't do that, the first step after that is to do what they term a jar test. And if you're interested in the process of doing a jar test, I can supply you a guide on how to do a jar test. So that's a test where you will put the required amounts of product into a jar, give it a shake, make sure it doesn't fizz, bubble and pop and do things that it shouldn't do, to make sure it's physically compatible. And then you should always spray it on a small area of the crop first, rather than go and spray 25 acres, just to check crop safety. But first point of a call is to ring the chemical supplier. They might have to ring the crop protection company like Syngenta or Bayer, but if it's a common mix, it's likely we would have done that testing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Scott. Good question. We've also got another one. When would concentrate spraying be appropriate in the berry context? Would I be right in thinking it would be quite limited?
It'd be interesting. Yeah, I think berries as a crop, I think generally from my experience, and I'm talking a lot of strawberries, historically it was probably more dilute spraying than concentrate spraying. And to the point we're probably using higher volumes of water than actually required to do the job. And the problem with using too much water is you wash it off the plant, you get runoff, and you put the product on the plastic or on the ground where it's not offering disease control or insect control. As growers have got more efficient, we're all time poor. We want to do more with less. I think you'll find that concentrate spraying, particularly with those products where there is a rate per 100 litres, is becoming more common than you might think. Because I question, and I haven't done as much work in the berry industry as I have in grapes and tree crops, and I've just done a lot of work in macadamias. I've been over to New Zealand in the viticulture industry, and I would say in tree crops and vine crops, still to this point of time, 95% of growers are not estimating their dilute water volume correctly. And if you don't estimate that correctly, particularly where you have a rate per 100 litres, you run the risk of underdosing or overdosing. Whereas the rate per hectare, it makes it a much easier calculation.
Good to know. Thanks, Scott. We've got towards the end of our session. So if you have any further questions, feel free to send them through to me. I will just share my screen. One moment. Down to here. Hopefully you can see that. So yeah, if you have any further questions, feel free to email me or give me a call. I'm happy to pass it on to Scott as well. Just like to say a huge thank you again, Scott. We really appreciate you making the time to present to us all. Today's been absolutely fantastic and really informative. So I'll send an email out to you all in the next couple of days with today's slides, and also with the quick feedback survey, which I also have on the screen at the moment. You can just put your phone on that and it should pick that up. Really appreciate you filling that out because it helps us plan events in the future. So yeah, thank you again, and yeah, I might see some of you at BerryQuest in a couple of weeks, but otherwise I look forward to seeing some of you at various events in the future. So thank you very much.
Everyone. Thanks everyone, and thanks for allowing me to present. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks so much.